Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and Medivate, a community and set of tools to help you build the kind of meditation practice you'd like to have, online at medivate.com. I've just got finished telling you how I'm experiencing the disorientation of the first time in England, and I've only been here less than a day. Tell me, what the disorientation of a new place, is that a useful headspace in your work?
I'm somebody who likes systems in a way. I like an idea of control, not in a scary way, but I like to feel a confidence in knowing where I am. So there is always that moment of disorientation when I travel, but actually it's the moment after 2 or 3 days when suddenly you feel a control of an area, in a sense. You know how places connect, how connections are made. And I suppose much of my work, if I think about it, is about connections. It's about social connections. It's about connecting geography and people and ideas. And travel in so many ways is an inspiration. I mean, from an idea of difference to the kind of frictions and the stress involved with it, and also the skill set you learn through traveling, the things one learns to do, and you look around you at other travelers and you think, you fools, you crazy fools, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be wearing that on a long journey, or you shouldn't be drinking that or eating that kind of thing. And, there's a skill set to be gained from a lifestyle of traveling, actually.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in London with Robin Rimbaud, better known as Scanner, recording and performing artist, a global traveling explorer of sound and image. We'll be talking about both the exploring and the sound and the image well, I shouldn't say both, because there are many categories of subject we can cover here and the ways you work. But let me clarify something much more simple. What part of London are we in right now?
We are in East London. We are currently in the poorest borough in the whole of London, a large Asian community. By Asian, I mean Indian community. It's an area of great change. I moved here 14 or 15 years ago. I moved here because it was the cheapest place to be in London. I moved here because I wanted two things in my life, really. I wanted light and I wanted high ceilings. So where I am is a former factory. It's a factory that used to make soap. In fact, Sunlight soap. It's the soap that I was washed with as a baby. This kind of horrendous industrial strength soap. The joke being always, when people read my address, they always think, wow, does it smell nice where you live?
This isn't still a known soap then?
I think it still exists. It's probably being made by some, Chinese company somewhere. It's not the kind of thing that you and I would probably use. You could probably remove paint with it, I think, these days.
The desire for light and high ceilings, are these things you never had growing up?
I think, you will recognise, as you've just arrived in London, if you travel around the UK, you'll notice that most houses have quite low ceilings. People were smaller in the past. Not that I'm a giant by any means. And windows are often, covered in curtains, net curtains, so there's not so much light coming through. And I remember, growing up reading interviews with John Cage talking about his loft apartment in New York. And I always had this fantasy of living somewhere that had great light. And where we are sitting now, we have these large glass brick windows. And it means, you feel connected with the outside. I'm not in a hermetic space. And I don't want ceilings that kind of crush me down. I like a sense of openness.
Now, as we discussed beforehand, you just came back from Sydney, Australia, land known for its blazing sunlight. What frame of mind does it put you into when you are in a place where there's just this, I assume, this orb always on you, pulsing light down on you?
It's great, actually. I mean, I suppose it's interesting. I always think of what a friend of mine said when he moved from LA, and he'd been living there for some years, an English friend, and he said, it was a great joy to come back to London for some moments, he said, because there is a variety of weathers here. Yes. Not that I enjoy freezing, but there's a pleasure sometimes to be taken in that difference, actually, in wrapping up and going out into a kind of wet, cold day. there's something pleasurable wouldn't be the right word to say, but there's an engagement that can be quite. It's a sense of adventure, I suppose, in a way. But there's also a joy to be found when I'm in Sydney and I'm there for a week and it's 30 degrees, which is about sort of 80 degrees Fahrenheit every day. There's a pleasure to be found in that. But also when you come back, there's always that moment as soon as you step off the plane and you feel the cold air just sort of hovering across your skin, on your face and your hands. And there's always that realization, I think, when you travel. When I just flew back and we landed in Singapore, the heat that rises as soon as you step off the plane, because you're existing for some time in this hermetic air-conditioned system. So as soon as you feel the natural air, there's always that great pleasure. It's not always, you don't always feel very healthy at those moments, having not slept and being sweaty and not had the opportunity to brush your teeth properly or anything. But there's that moment of, again, of change, which is quite exciting, And I feel quite fortunate that my work over the last 20 years has brought me to places which I would never, ever have probably conceived of going to. I probably never, if I were working in a standard job, I wouldn't probably think of going to Guangzhou for the weekend. Or
unless you had a factory there or something.
Exactly, yes, making soap. Yes. But that's been one of the great joys of making work, actually. It's taken me to places that I don't choose, in a way. And though I began by saying that I'm interested in ideas of control, I think what I enjoy about my work is it takes me to places that I could not anticipate. It brings in collaborations, connections to places and people that would never otherwise happen. We wouldn't be talking here if it wasn't for me having done something and you having done something. And I think that's one of the great pleasures of travel, actually, is those kind of connections. Not only the people you meet when you travel on a plane, in a taxi, wherever it may be, but the relationships that exist afterwards, both with the people and the places, and the way you can start, in a sense, early on, you have a black and white portrait of the world, a general idea of what an atlas is. And suddenly, now, you have an idea of the full colour. You have an idea, the perverse idea that when you go to Australia, they speak pretty much the same language. They drive on the same side of the road. The habits are quite similar in a way. But then you'll go somewhere else which is so alien to your habits. Let's say the first time I went to China, and all the kind of different tiny microscopic differences that exist in every walk of life that you just have to adjust to in that brief time.
Now, what systems, as you say, do you have in place to best use these differences, best incorporate them into your thinking?
I think one of the most important things is to embrace the now, in a sense, is to accept that this is different. I know I had a couple of American friends stay with me when I was a teenager in London, and as soon as they arrived here, they kept complaining that, in fact, the money was different here.
Just that it was different money, not that the money was any worse, but just that it wasn't dollars.
The line the girlfriend of my friend kept saying, it's really stupid. Stupid, you got different money here. And then it was stupid, we eat different food. And, it's very easy to be dismissive of those kind of differences, in a sense. But in fact, it was quite ironic at that time because what they did, she travelled, she didn't believe we had anything to eat here, so she filled her suitcase up with kind of crunchy bars and fruit bars, and also bought the most gigantic industrial strength hairdryer with her. And, of course, only to discover that it doesn't work on the electricity system here, which was quite funny, I have to admit, after this girl was moaning so much. So, one of the tactics I always use is just to embrace what's there, just to accept this is different, and let's enjoy it and see what's different. And a little bit like being an alien landing on another planet, let's look at that place and see what all the positive stuff it can bring to you. It's very, very easy to complain about things in the world, very, very easy, and to complain about your position and where you are. It's sometimes harder to embrace difference and realize why it succeeds and why it's important to you and what frictions and what pluses it can bring to you. So when I travel, I tend as far as possible to immerse myself in that local environment. The thing I don't do is go to sleep and nap. I try immediately to adapt to the current system of where I am, which means, having landed in Sydney last week at 7 a.m., my wife and I in the evening then went to the opera at 8 o'clock to see a Purcell opera, which when you haven't slept for a day and a half may not have been the best thing to have done, but also it was very important just to think, okay, we're going out to this event. Right. The next day we wake up at a normal time, and you follow that pattern. It's very important. Pattern is very, very important in all walks of life, but especially when you're traveling.
This is like a cultural extension of that old idea that, or the old traveler's tip, when you land, don't sleep until the other people are sleeping, until the actual people who live there are sleeping at the normal time. Don't go to the opera until they're going to the opera. You're immediately engaged in the place you end up in. And tell me, exposure to different places, when did that start teaching you things about what goes on in London, about the systems of London, about the place you come from?
I suppose one thing you always realise immediately is an idea of comfort and convenience, and you know your own city better than anything else. And so there's a real joy sometimes of returning home and realising I don't have to keep thinking about where to eat. I can eat at home, I can cook food myself. I know how things work. One of the other aspects of travelling is that you have to try and adapt to things like travel systems. How do the buses work? How do the trains work? Can I really afford to take taxis everywhere? No, I can't. So how does this work? The first time I went to Vietnam, the big question was, how do I cross the road? Right. Which may sound absurd, but unless you've been to Vietnam, you've never experienced anything quite like watching thousands of motorcyclists crossing each other with clearly no logic of left and right or backwards and forwards, just everybody going everywhere.
And yet it happens somehow. You see this school of fish swimming.
And then you just learn the best thing to do is you just walk out there and you just go, you walk slowly, and fingers crossed everybody avoids you. But there are those moments, there's those incredible moments. So when you come home, it's actually traveling is a great way to see your own home. In a way, you start reflecting and echoing on what you have, because it's very easy to become blind to what's around you. And I suppose many works I've made over the years have been a way of retuning you to an environment, to listen not only to the voices, but the sound of the city, the environment, the look of it as well. And, if I'm taking photographs, it's a way of documenting that place, but not in a traditional way. I think, well, if I'm traveling, I can buy much better photographs in a book or see them online of great buildings. What I can't take photographs of or capture in a book is things like the food I've eaten, the people I've met, the hotel rooms.
Photos as note-taking, as aid to memory.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's a way of these kind of little signifiers that spring up immediately. And everybody recognises this moment of looking at a trivial photo of a glass on a table, which to you may look like a glass on a table, but I know that was the glass that I drank 17 years ago, sitting in a cafe in Paris with these people.
It has a rich meaning in the context of your memories.
Yeah, and I think that's the memory aspect is really, really important in many of my works and our walks of life. Is really important how our memory works and what tricks it can play, and how we can store those memories. Today, one could argue that everybody is a photographer. Not that they want to ever thought of being a photographer, but their smartphones generally allow them to capture those cities. No. What I like with a smartphone is that I can record audio. So I spent my New Year in Den Bosch in the Netherlands, and I recorded that New Year, the sound of the fireworks, the voices, the exhilaration in people as midnight struck. And when I was a teenager, when I first went to Berlin, I recorded my trip to Berlin. I recorded my walking through the streets, my trip through to the west, or from the west to the east border, all those kind of things. And in fact now, not that I listen to them, but in fact there's a plastic bag behind you filled with those cassettes, which are in a sense my memories, in a way, my audio memories. And I know if I were to listen to those, I would immediately be drawn back to 1986, walking through East Berlin. And it's a great tool in that way, of playing with memory.
I was just speaking with a musician back in Los Angeles a few weeks ago who said, when you're a musician who came up in a certain era, you say to yourself, my life is all on cassette tapes, because he says those are where you made your notes, just trying out ideas. Nothing he does is particularly experimental, this guy I'm talking about, but in your case, it's literally true. Your memories are on those tapes because they're recordings of places. They're literally what you were hearing at the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What's quite funny, I just realised where we're sitting. If you were to look up to the top, you see all these books. Yes. It's my diaries since I was 12 years old.
Oh, my.
And every day of my life is is sitting on a shelf above us. I've recorded every single day since I was 12 years old.
Now, it's not terribly uncommon to begin a diary at 12, but it is pretty uncommon to continue it into adulthood. Tell me, what can you point to explain why you have been disciplined about that?
It's such a simple question with almost no answer in a way, in that it became a habit. It was almost a way of, in a technical way, of downloading, in a sense, of releasing this stuff from the day. And the more I wrote as the years passed, the more it was a way of not necessarily capturing and documenting my life, because I have no intention of somebody publishing these. They're not for you or anybody else to read. It's a way of me remembering a moment. You know, sometimes I write the page every day. Sometimes it just literally writes about one thing that happens that day. Sometimes it's about all kind of detail. Sometimes it's very personal. Sometimes it's just about work. It very much varies. There's no necessary theme to it. But I suppose the key word is discipline. One thing I'm very good at is being disciplined. You know, I've never, ever missed a day, no matter whether I'm traveling on a plane to New Zealand or Australia. In the middle of the night, when I wake up and realize it's time to write my diary, out comes the diary and I write it in a fountain pen, because I was trained at school to always use fountain pens, not biros or anything. And as old-fashioned as it sounds, it's really important that it's about the mechanics of physical handwriting. You know, friends of mine who've seen me do it in the past and they've traveled with me say, why didn't you just do it on your phone? Why didn't you do it on your laptop? But actually, it's not the same relationship. It's not the same relationship of my hand physically touching the paper.
You wouldn't be in the frame of mind that was suitable to write in a diary if you were typing on this keyboard in front of us, for example.
And also, it gives me a discipline of the time, because there's only so many words I can write. So, perverse as that may sound, it means I have to capture each day in approximately 500 to 700 words in my small handwriting in that book. But yeah, as we sit here, behind you is a plastic bag filled with cassettes from the age of about 10 or 11. There are boxes up here filled with DAT tapes from about the last 20 years of all audio recordings. Over here, these shelves here are my audio archive. So there's all both commercial CDs that have come out, but all the other kind of anonymous looking sleeves, the kind of layers of white plastic sleeves, are all just demos back from the last 20, 25 years. Our live recordings, sketches, all kinds of stuff. Before we had the ability to store things just on hard drives on computers. So I'm a great archivist in that way. I have flyers and tickets from events I went to as a teenager, all kinds of things. The diaries are full of these aspects. And, you know, I suppose in some way, much of my life has been about documenting, in a sense. I suppose even the early scanner recordings I was making were very much about documenting stories and people's voices. The cassettes I reference when I was 11 and 12 are recordings of my family. They're recordings of us having dinner, those kinds of things. Nothing, it's not like I sat there and thought, I want to be an artist. Right. It was because, and this is interesting, it's because the technology existed that I was able to do it. And I think that's the same as I made the reference to smartphones. It's because a phone has the ability to take photographs that people take photographs and share them. And because we had a battery-powered cassette recorder, I suddenly realized I could record us having dinner. And so I have recordings of those, you know, incredibly banal moments, but also I have recordings of things like Spider-Man in 1976 and 1977 on TV, before videotapes were around and before you could record cartoons and whatever TV show you wanted to. I have cassettes here of me introducing each show. So I say something like, Spider-Man and the adventures of the great me. And I talk like this, obviously about, 10 or 11 years old. And then you hear the episode, and every now and then you hear my mother walk in and ask if we want some toast or something like that as I watch the show with my brother. And yet at the same time, there are these great moments which just capture, my own history. It's a very personal thing, and I have no particular intention of sharing this with anybody, those recordings, because they weren't made for other people either. They were made for me.
I have memories of doing the exact same thing with television shows, recording them, myself talking and recording the shows themselves as well. But, as we say, anybody can record anything now with their smartphones. Everybody can document. Everybody occasionally does document. But I'll venture to say that they do it unsystematically. And without a system, documentation it's a whole different thing, isn't it? Documentation with a system means something more than without a system, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's essential that now that this happens every day. You know, it's the same as brushing my teeth at the end of the day. You don't necessarily think, why am I brushing my teeth? What purpose does this serve?
Right.
Because you know it does good. My writing my diary is this way of letting this stuff go, you know, and also of storing things. I have other notebooks which are much more based on ideas. I have piles of these notebooks which are sketches of things I want to make or connections I've made, quotes I've read from a book, all kinds of things. Like lots of people, you know, keep notebooks and they have a different kind of discipline. I don't write in those every day. It's when that moment insists that it has to happen and then I capture it. Whereas the diary is captured every day. With recording, I record as much as possible every day. I write music every day, you know, because it's my oxygen in a way. It's how I exist. 2 publishing companies have approached me over the years with interest to publish the diaries, and both times I've declined it because I thought, well, it would also change the way I wrote them, because I'd begin writing them for you and other people to read.
Right.
And they're not to deceive people and tell them how amazing someone's life is. They're there basically for my own personal sake, you know.
Right.
And if I started writing them with an intention of somebody else reading it, I probably would edit myself a lot more. I wouldn't be as honest. You know, I would start playing with it in a different way. And I don't want to do that. These books are about me. They are my portrait.
It reminds me of a book I'm sure you've at least seen, but it's Brian Eno's diary from 1995-96, A Year with Swollen Appendices. And he even says, you look at the first few months, it's just these utilitarian entries, what he did that day, the work he was doing. And then somewhere along the line, he found he had a contract to publish these, and they turned voluminous and detailed and written for an outside world. You know, you can see the transition from for him to for them, and you don't want to be writing for them, ultimately, you yourself.
No, absolutely. I was thinking of the Eno diaries when you said that, because he was very much commissioned to write those, and I'm sure, you know, that I mean, I've known Eno for many years, and he keeps these notebooks on creative works. I would like to see those. I would love to see what kind of notes are being made there. When I've sat with him, he's made all these notes, and I'm always wanting to lean over thinking, what are you doing there, Brian? What are you writing about? And I'm sure he'd show me if I was keen. In fact, there was a book just came out recently called Visual Music, which actually has some of the notebooks printed in it. But it's absolutely that. It's about the ownership of it as well, in a sense. You know, this is for me, and it's private. And I think it's important these days as well to make to recognize the difference between public and private, which can be very hard for people to understand these days. You know, you hear tales of people posting things on social networks, be it Facebook or Twitter, very, very private feelings or whatever, which are sometimes often incredibly offensive or of not interest to other people. And I think it's important to recognize still what actually private means, because we've lost the kind of notion, in a sense, for lots of people, what that is anymore. You know, you will certainly have, you know, with the success of the selfie, you know, do we really care what you look like and how you are looking in the mirror and how you are taking this picture at the end of your, you know, arm reach, in a sense? No, nobody really cares, but we're made to care because it's shown back at us through another media, in a sense. Right. It's a very curious moment in time, and I'm not sure at what point we will kind of not necessarily rebel against it, but suddenly reflect on it and think this is absolutely absurd. I mean, this really is just ridiculous. This kind of privatization of the most basic moments, you know, of not privatization, but sharing the most private moments. I've never watched them, but these the
privatized becomes publicized.
Yeah, yes. And it's interesting because when I first started making my work in the early 90s as Scanner, it was using these private phone calls of other people. And I was not interested in who those people were. What I was interested in were the stories and the kind of nuances of conversation, how one person talks to another without censorship in a way. Now, we're talking in its type of performance. You know, when we switch a microphone off, we relax more. Our voices change, the tonality changes. If you were to ring your bank now, you would have a very different stance as well. You'd be presenting yourself in a different way. And I think that...
Turn my card back on. I'm in London.
Yes, exactly. But that's what's really interesting, is that we have these thousands of different voices to a loved one, to a family, to a bank manager, to a friend, to a airline, whoever it may be. And what I was interested in is that moment of enter in that space when two people are talking and they aren't censoring themselves. They are just talking. What happens today, of course, is that people are constantly aware that they're being listened to, or are they? I don't know. That's a bigger question. And they censor themselves, or do they? Or do they just let all this stuff come out, you know? And I think it's interesting that 20 years ago, there was no internet as we know it today. There was no ability to search for somebody using a search engine. There was no ability to enter into kind of social networks and see how connected people are to other people. And I think it's, you know, it was interesting because I was talking very much then about issues of public and private and how far one can go with using private information. Whereas today we are utterly saturated by a culture that is almost obsessed with that stuff. And it's of such little greater value, that stuff. It's so insipid and so empty and vacuous that it's quite horrifying, I think. And I do wonder in 15 or 20 years' time if people are looking at this thinking, what were we doing? Unless, of course, it's gone even further and we are just naked all the time in all media.
We do joke about somebody tweeting about what sandwich they ate that day, and I think, well, who would want to read that? But suddenly I think, well, if they tweeted every sandwich they ate, every meal they ate for 30 years, maybe I would want to see that. Just if they systematically did it. You know, we don't want to necessarily see anybody's given selfie, but the guy who shot himself facing the camera every day for 7 years and then made a video out of it, everyone wants to see that. Is it a difference simply of systems there?
I know there's huge disparities there, aren't there? Of course, you know, I think it's a very valuable point you made, which is there is something really intriguing about change like that. I remember when I was a teenager and I discovered Mayakovsky, and the Russian poet and writer was taking photographs of himself, the kind of selfies back in the sort of 1920s, these amazing black and white portraits of himself. And I remember going to photo booths quite a lot then and taking photos of myself to document how I looked. Because you could never see yourself in a way. And I think, you know, the notion of the selfie is kind of, I hate this term, but it has that the portrait in a sense has that ability to reflect on yourself and see how you are. And I'm intrigued by people who have made those projects where they are disciplined to take photographs for a year every day. And you look at the change, not only in skin tone, but if they're tired, if they're ill, their hair length, all kinds of things. And that's quite fascinating, actually. I suppose what I'm more unsettled by is, I'm not alone in this, is now a very easy acceptance of people who seem to have an entitlement to success through being incredibly banal, you know, by which I mean those kind of TV shows, those characters that we all know, that basically don't really do anything, but they keep constantly posting pictures of themselves with a new pair of shoes or a dress or a hat or out somewhere. And I think, do I really care? No, I don't. I only know about you because I happened to find you in a newspaper on the train that I picked up, you know. And it's an intriguing, you know, there are disparities between those different worlds. I suppose I'm coming from a side of creativity and where the kind of creative impulse is with that and how people can use it, exploit it in a positive way to share something. So when you speak about that man who made those images over 5 or 7 years, and there's something really moving and beautiful about that film, actually, when you see it. But just looking at single photographs of individuals that I don't care about, I have no feelings about, leaves me utterly cold.
Right. Well, it's no meaning. It's like you mentioned the photo of, was it the water glass? You knew it was your water glass 17 years ago on this trip. You're seeing somebody else's water glass, and that means nothing, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And therefore, you know, you start to ask yourself the questions of how do these social systems work, those kind of networks? What do they lead towards? What is the success of it? You know, when you write a Facebook update, when you write something on Twitter, how much are you thinking about what you're writing? How much are you thinking my readers, let's call them that, my friends, my consumers, how much are they going to react to this? Are you promoting something? Are you sharing a really trivial moment? And it all comes down to something to me recently, which is really revealing. I found a photograph 2 weeks ago of a baby gorilla. The baby gorilla, it was 2 images. And I found it on another website. It's a gorilla with a stethoscope being put onto his tummy. His face is absolutely fantastic. It's the most joyful photograph because he's reacting to the cold. It's the most human expression. I posted that photograph. I've never, in my experience of social networks since they first began, experienced anything quite like this, where this image has been retweeted thousands and thousands of times, such that 2 weeks later, if I look in my stream, it will say John Smith and 5,000 other people retweeted your tweets. And underneath that, it will say Mary Smith retweeted this plus 2,000, and it goes on, and it just doesn't stop.
Eventually everybody in the world has seen it.
Yeah, basically, it's like a waterfall. And I think it's a picture of a baby gorilla. If I was to put anything else, it would maybe be retweeted 3 times or something. And, one can't judge on that, because I thought it was a beautiful photo, actually. I thought it was very sweet. It was cute. But it's interesting how that has been the most successful thing that I've retweeted and people have responded to. And I think what I'm leading to is interesting, which is that now about another 100 people began to follow me because of this photograph. So they saw the photograph of a baby gorilla and thought, wow, I must follow this guy because he puts pictures of baby gorillas. I have no intention necessarily of publishing anything else like that. And, today I posted on a Derek Jarman book. I'm sure, 99% of those people would look at that tweet thinking, who on earth is Derek Jarman? And so on. But that
1% overlap that's somewhat interesting.
Exactly. And I think that's what I'm leading to say, which is the joy of it is being able to share that stuff with people who would never otherwise access that I'm saying stuff because it could be anything. Yes. But there's something incredibly rewarding about that, actually, thinking I've suddenly accessed this other world through a picture of a gorilla, which I had no intention of doing, which is just very amusing.
I imagine you, like me, do the mental exercise of thinking about one interest of yours or one person you know and wondering, how exactly did I get this interest or get to know this person? Because it always ends up being such a meandering chain through your life and through your previous interests. I mean, have you done that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's a writer I discovered when I was a teenager called B.S. Johnson, Brian Stanley Johnson, who back in the late 70s, nobody had really heard of, And I bought his books as a teenager when I was 16 through book collectors in the UK, where you had to write a letter to a bookshop in Brighton and say, if by any chance you have a book by B.S. Johnson come in, could you please let me know? And they would then send me a letter and say, yes, here it is. It will cost you £7. Please send us a check. And then you'd have to send them the check. Whereas quite clearly today, it's a heck of a lot easier to do that. But, if I start to think, well, how did I discover B.S. Johnson when I was 16? Because I bought a second-hand book, which was a history of literature. And they had a photograph of a box, and I just liked the image of the box. And I thought, wow, a writer making a book with a box, how is that possible? And so then it was this kind of endless obsessive search for this work. Interestingly, today, B.S. Johnson, there are seminars on his work. They've republished many of his publications, early books and everything, although some of them are still out of print. But I love sometimes just sitting there and trying to think, how did I reach at this point? What brought me to be in Sydney, for example? Why was I in Sydney performing these reinterpretations of Baroque music? Right. Because some years ago, I'd made some other versions of Bach tunes. Why did I make those Bach tunes? Because somebody else asked me to do this thing. Why did that person ask me? And the kind of strange connection line, the thread just gets ever more complex, actually, as you look at it.
You send me on this whole thing of how did I get to be in London right here now? But I mean, B.S. Johnson, I'm a reader of his as well. And of course, he's also English. I don't know if he has London roots. Do you agree? I think I read the biography, but I forgot chunks of it. The books themselves have stayed with me, though, especially The Unfortunates, the book in a box. So that sticks with anybody, I think, even just the form, but the content. I didn't start following your work because I knew you liked B.S. Johnson, right? I mean, that just happens to be coincidental. I mean, is that what you consider? What do you consider to be that form of? I mean, it's sort of a striking coincidence, but it's some sort of connection as well. I mean, what is the utility of these things you find out? How this recording artist I follow also likes I suppose you'd call it an avant-garde novelist who's been dead a long time. You know what I mean?
No, it's for me, it's one of the great joys of life, actually, when you keep moving forward. And it's one of the things, the older you get, what I enjoy about getting older is the moment of reflection. The landscape is so much bigger. You can make so many more connections. But, there's a great joy in not only meeting people in themselves, but then realizing that you've got this other connection and this other connection and this other connection. It's probably more rarefied to discover musicians, experimental musicians, interested in experimental literature, also interested in visual arts, also interested, I don't mean I'm unique because there's quite a lot of people like me, but, there's a great pleasure to be found in somebody who likes the work of B.S. Johnson, because you'd think, maybe that then means they like the work of this person, and maybe it connects to this in music, And there's few figures. David Grubbs, the American musician, I know we'd often speak about literature. But, he's a musician, ostensibly, and a kind of academic at the same time. But there's a great pleasure to be found in making those connections. I mean, I studied literature at university, but I was always interested in music from about the age of 10 and 11. And so books became as key to me as music was, in a way. And so, this morning I buy a Derek Jarman book of poetry online. At the same time as yesterday, I bought a CD. As the previous week, I went to an exhibition. As this afternoon, I'm going to the cinema. For me, this thing called culture is our lives. It's not just a thing. It's something that I utterly embrace and is so part of my well-being. I would be starved if I could not have access to that. I really, I feel sometimes when I travel how fortunate I am that, I'm able to pick up and remain tuned in to all this stuff that's going on. And much of my life is very much staying on news groups and ensuring that I know there's this exhibition coming on. I don't want to miss it. That, there's this publication coming out I want to discover, because they all, in a sense, reflect back on my own practice. So when I went to Amsterdam 2 weeks ago to see this Brothers Quay exhibition, that was really important, because as I'm looking through the exhibition, it's a visual exhibition of models, maquettes, early student films, Jan Schwankmeyer connections, all kinds of things. Suddenly there's a mention of Bernard Parmigiani, the French composer, the electroacoustic composer. And so that leads me in another direction. Suddenly there's a mention of Robert Walser, the Swiss writer. Suddenly there's a mention of, these other figures. And the way these dots all connect together, for me, is really quite magical, actually. There's a great reward. For me personally, I'm not sure if it's of any interest to other people, but suddenly, I go to New York and suddenly see an exhibition of Unike Zorn drawings, the German writer who used to live with Hans Bellmer. And, again, I say the great thing about getting older is learning all those things and getting all those wires to connect, how they connect to everything. But again, it all feeds into the joy of basically living. Actually, for me, the older I've got, the more I've recognized that what's really important in my life is to enjoy it. I work very hard, but I tend not to work at the weekend. And I stop work around 6 o'clock in the evening. We spoke about discipline earlier. I'm very disciplined. I wake up early. I start work around 7:30. I work through to 6 in the evening and I stop. I don't work in the evenings. If I have a commission that I've, been invited to work on and they expect me to work, in those hours, I tend to think either you're going to have to pay me danger money or this is really going to have to be worth it. But generally I won't work, in that way, because the value of enjoyment and pleasure in your life is also very, very important to get those two things balanced. And in the past, I probably did work much too hard and worked through to the evenings and worked all over the weekend, but try not to do it anymore.
Now, we speak about connections and about enjoyment and about figures that have been called avant-garde, and we speak about Twitter. There was something I tweeted recently, which I've still been thinking along these lines, but I'm not sure if it's true or not. But I ventured that when somebody says they don't like a piece of culture, they really mean they can't connect it to anything in their lives. You don't not like things. You don't hook up to them. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, I think, because, are there not moments when you've been to something that you really think I should be enjoying? This is, everything on paper says this is for me. And you arrive there and realize it just didn't work. Now, is it because of a failure that evening, simply because of you, because you were a bit hungry? You were a bit tired, something stressed you out in the day and you couldn't fully engage in it? Or is it simply just not for you in that way? Culture is a beautifully enticing thing in that way, because, it embraces everything from television and cinema and sculpture and public arts and performance and word and theatre and literature and poetry and dance and all kinds of things, painting, sculptures, you name it. And it's so easy for people, particularly in politics, sometimes you realize that they fail to recognize the value it actually has in both the enjoyment of our lives, the kind of goodness, and also the education of our place in society in a way. There's something so engaging about traveling and recognizing how different art forms play a different role in people's lives. So when you go to the first time I went to Vietnam again, I remember going to a public performance of a kind of a very historical opera, which to my ears was the most hideously difficult, complex thing.
Right.
It was just the kind of harmonies were playing against everything I'd grown up with, but it was packed with people, and not just people you'd think who'd go to the opera. Right. It was just everybody was there. It was such a phenomenal moment. And I like those kind of joyful engagements of culture, whether it's Chinese New Year, whether it's whatever it may be, whether it's the Olympics and that kind of cultural engagement, this kind of sport engagement. It's really important just to make those connections with people, because often people feel very isolated. It's very easy to find, certainly in big cities, that people feel very lonely and very isolated. And, there's something I find that was particularly with the art form of music, it's about a shared sensibility. Music is something often that you engage in with other people, not only in performance yourself, but when you go to a concert, a performance, it's usually a group of people, be it 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000. I'm only talking about, obviously, my concerts with the 50,000. And it's that moment that you share. And I think that's really, really important. I went to a concert recently, and it was hideous where the people in the audience kept singing along to the tunes. It was Arcade Fire. And everybody around me was singing so badly to it that I couldn't actually enjoy the concert. But then I thought, that's what they're enjoying. They just love in that moment. That sounds incredible. It sounds like a Coca-Cola advert line, but it's really... important to embrace that moment.
We mentioned, and I think back to his Portsmouth Sinfonia, where they're playing classical music, but nobody's trained, and it's a huge orchestra. And eventually it all evens out, and all you hear is the passion if you tune yourself in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've heard recordings of them, they're quite hideous. They're quite funny, actually. It really sounds like amateur dramatic music, because people with the best will and intention are trying to play these pieces, but yes, they're playing very, very bum notes at times. But
there's so many of them that it just becomes soft focused.
Exactly. And that's the joy of it, because what you're recognizing is here are people who are committed to wanting something to happen. And for them, it's about making that commitment. It's about having that discipline and trying their damn hardest to make it happen, even though they may not be the most skilled. And, I have every kind of support and empathy for characters like that, because I'm a terrible musician in a general way, but I try my best every time.
You mentioned hearing a performance that sounds hideous to your ears. It strikes your ears wrong, but many people are there loving it. So, when there's an undeniable amount of people who love something that you're not hooking up to right away, for me, the fascination shifts to, it's like, well, a lot of people love this. Now that fascinates me. Maybe the performance doesn't. Maybe you talk about reality stars who are famous for no reason that's readily apparent, yet they are, if not beloved, then they demand a lot of attention. I mean, you have them, seems like even more in the UK sometimes than there are in the US. Does the fact that a lot of people like something itself become fascinating to you when that happens?
Isn't it? I mean, I think that's really intriguing. I'm always struck by, in different art forms, be it a band, and you think, okay, that's why I'm completely addicted to wanting to hear everything. I buy a lot of music, but I download a lot of music because I want to hear what this stuff is. When I'm disappointed, I try and work out what is the intrigue here? Why does everybody like this? What is it about that makes it of an appeal to a wider audience? And sometimes it's rather a challenge to work out, I mean, you can see it, with pop music, but you think, what is it? I mean, the Miley Cyrus story is always interesting, thinking, what is it about her that interests people? Could you name, in fact, you are to ask the average person one, could you name 2 Miley Cyrus songs? I won't ask you now, I won't put you on the spot. But
I will admit I can't do it, but it's not an embarrassing admission because...
You can do it, sorry, you can.
I can't.
Right.
It's not embarrassing to admit that I can't do it because I'm not the target audience. If I were a 12-year-old girl, maybe that would be embarrassing, but, I'm 29. It's not going to hurt my credibility yet. Everybody knows who Miley Cyrus is. I don't know if you have any better conclusions than I do about why. I don't know.
No, but it's I think it's what's intriguing is cultural phenomenons fascinate me in that way. The way that something can be a huge success Yet you were sitting there thinking, I can't quite work out. Now, I can understand with her. She's a pretty girl who uses sexuality to sell an image. It's quite basic.
That's a dime a dozen. Let's admit it, though.
Yeah.
Like, there's what else is it with her? That why is she the one of those that is so well known? Do you know what I mean? A chance? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a huge chance factor, isn't there, in all these aspects. And I think, the history of our culture is the chance factors of all the things that disappear, and you think, why was that not just a huge hit? That film is absolutely amazing. That band is incredible. Why does nobody hear them? We've all
probably think that every day about things.
I think that about my career every day. No, but it is a really curious phenomenon, to try and work it out. And so I'm always fascinated by things. I think I've always argued that it's very important to see and experience things you don't like, because then it gives you value to understand what you do like. And so I try and experience, I'm a member of our local cinema. And I try and see almost every film that comes out, even the most trashy film, because I want to see what the appeal is in it. And sometimes you can be very pleasantly surprised and think, I can see why this is. It's affectionate. It's a gem. The humor is very strong. Then other things I see and think, I just don't get it. I find this really offensive. I find it cruel. I find it, unpleasant. And so, I find it really important to always try and engage in stuff that also I don't like. So when I used the word hideous earlier, I mean, to my ears, it was hideous. First of all, it was frightening in a sense, the harmonies. But then you realize actually, this is different. And it's really important to recognize and embrace that difference. And so, my life has been very much spent with wanting to socially engage with as much, and I use this term again, stuff as possible, creativity. Because I want to have that bigger picture painted again and again, my life has been about learning that stuff and making those connections again. And I go back to where we started in a sense. It's about making those connections and realizing why I like this, why I don't like that. There's always the argument that the music in particular and kind of arts, I suppose, in general, do you experience between the age of something like 16 and 22 stay with you for life? Which means that the awful 1980s music that sometimes I might want to listen to, that my friends might go, why on earth do you like that record? Because it has a resonance for me when I grew up.
It's an example of one of these records.
I don't know, let's say Throbbing Gristle, the group Throbbing Gristle. We're not talking about a commercial band, but I remember when I was a teenager and I bought a record at the age of 15, a Throbbing Gristle record. And my friend said to me, this is just awful. This is just noise. Today, they're a much more popular group, but it's still seen as quite noisy and quite awful. Glenn Branca is my classic moment. I went to a concert by the American composer Glenn Branca when I was 15 or 16, when his band was largely members of the band Sonic Youth. And they played a show in London. I'd read an article in the paper about them, and I was really intrigued. And basically the review said, this is what took me there. It said, the skies of London will go dark tonight. And I thought, wow, I have to go to this concert. I went.
It's going to be too dark outside to go anywhere else.
True. It was utterly life-changing. I mean, one of those events you go to. So much so that I bought another ticket for the next night, and I bought a ticket for a school friend. I took him along. He walked out. He hated it. He said, well, this is, the most awful noise I've ever heard. He said, I'd much rather listen to the British band Hawkwind. That's what it's all about. And I thought, well, that showed me then at the age of 15 or 16 that, that difference is really important. But what it taught me was I really loved that and he didn't love it, but we could still be friends. That was also important.
This reminds me of thinking back to teen years. I think back specifically to this part of them a lot where I think, why did people have such strong opinions about culture? Yes, but usually it's music. In your teen years, you ally yourself with a band. And then by definition, all other bands are bad. And you were a good example there because you realized you can still be friends with a friend who dismissed what you liked as noise. That's not that common anyway. As I recall, growing up in the States in the 90s, you had to join forces with some part of the musical spectrum. Why did we have to build our identities that way? I mean, I'm not including you in that because obviously you are on a higher level here, but why do so many kids have to, is it because they have so little to make their identities out of otherwise they have to just buy the right record and hope for the best, or what's going on?
It's a curious question, isn't it? I think, I would once argue that when in the past teenagers could rebel, nowadays you can't really rebel. What do they rebel against anymore? They can now buy their punk t-shirts at the local high street store. Yes. They can download all that music some years ago, it was much easier to rebel in a sense and to alienate people. I'm not saying you don't get teenagers who are rebelling anymore. They're trying their best to be obnoxious. But yeah, I think, a group sensibility is really important to feel part of a group, I think it's why, especially in the US, you have people like kind of emo fans, who have their very particular look, have a very particular image, a very particular type of music as well. But emo is not gothic. Remember, gothic is another group, and you have to be very careful with the delineation of all the different groups. But it is fascinating how there's that desire to want to belong, and then shortly afterwards, it seems, you want nothing to do with it, and you kind of resent that. I was always conscious of these groups when I grew up, but I was never part of any of them. I was somebody who grew up listening to so many different styles of music, but actually was quite honest with myself and think, actually, I'm really enjoying Nick Drake whilst I'm listening to Glenn Branca, whilst I'm enjoying Throbbing Gristle, whilst I'm reading poetry of Rupert Brooke, whilst I'm going to see a Tarkovsky film or a John Waters film at the same time as listening to, Roxy Music or Brian Eno. And I suppose that is more unusual. It's certainly not a higher plane. It's just an awareness of what you enjoy. And actually, I suppose in a sense, it's about being honest with yourself and recognizing, people generally like you for who you are, but when you're growing up, you don't know who you are, of course. You're trying to find an identity, and perhaps it helps to share an identity with others, because then you have an immediate connection, with those other people. I was interested in industrial experimental music as a teenager. You'd go to a concert of some of these things, and there'd probably only be 30 people there. You hear stories of Sex Pistols concerts, these legendary concerts, where, only 50 people were there, actually. But if you were to add up all the names of the people that said they were at that concert, we'd be up to several thousand. It's a kind of a cliche. But it's a sense of belonging. Isn't that what's really important? We all feel that. When you go to a concert, you're all there making that commitment for that moment. You've all come from different walks of life, but you all enjoy this artist, this style of music, or this film. And there is that sense of community in a way. And I suppose that's what social networks offer a lot of people today. Maybe there's less desire or need to join these other groups because social networks offer the glue that make people feel connected to other people these days. I'm not sure, but it's just a suggestion.
You mentioned the singer-songwriter Nick Drake, who actually came to my mind a few minutes ago talking about, of all people, B.S. Johnson. Not a lot of lines immediately to be drawn between them. Both English, both died young, both are now, their work is now followed more than it was in their lifetimes. Nobody would call Nick Drake avant-garde, but I feel like there is a connection between them in the sense that both of them were men alone in some sense, and it's what I hear, when you talk to people about. I was doing a series of interviews on Nick Drake maybe 5 years ago, actually, talking to his biographers, and they all said, well, he wasn't out there. He couldn't promote his albums as good as they were. He was too shy to stay on stage for more than a few minutes, and he didn't have many friends. B.S. Johnson was not a happy man, clearly. He had a tendency to alienate people, especially those who would publish him, for example. So the idea of the non-connected artist, it doesn't seem to matter because both of them are very good indeed. It doesn't matter how good you are if you're not really engaged in humanity, right? It's
a tricky one, isn't it? I think somebody once described my own work and myself, and they said that I could not be further removed from my work. My work is generally quite serious, intense, melancholic, and I'm quite a jovial, silly person, And, those figures, both those figures there, B.S. Johnson and Nick Drake, were very important to myself growing up, certainly as a teenager. And they were lonely male figures in this world fighting against a system that they despise. That's what's so interesting. Nick Drake wanted to write songs, but clearly had no interest in promoting them or playing concerts. B.S. Johnson was always fighting with publishers, didn't want to have books republished because he felt that they were of the moment. They were almost sort of these Polaroids of his thoughts and that story at that moment. They have no value any years later. And when, in that classic moment in his book where he basically says something like, fuck all these lies, what is this? And I think that's really, really important because it's an utter revelation. I've even toyed with the idea of, in a record, I remember making a note years ago thinking, should I be making a record and then just stopping it and just stopping the record halfway through and saying, look, what I'm trying to do here is tell this story to you about me, about these emotions, but in fact it's all being disguised in this musical picture that is never going to be quite what I want to tell you. Let me try and describe it to you now. Unfortunately, that would come across as so pretentious and so ridiculous probably in its absurdity. But, it's worth considering, I suppose, in a way. But, those figures are very significant, I think, particularly in a kind of British culture way as well, which are, they certainly weren't punks, but there were people who were refusing to adapt to the system. I mean, I'm somebody who's never had a major record label, never had a major publisher, never had an agent or manager in that way. I'm fiercely independent, I like to be able to control my own catalogue. I like to be able to look after it. I like to be able to work in whatever way I wish. And my audience, whoever they may be, seem to respect that at least. And I don't mean that arrogantly. They still follow me, whether it's a film I'm making, or whether it's a sound for a commercial project, or a very experimental dance piece, or a very pop single or something. They seem very open, and that's something I really, really love, actually. I really love that kind of openness. But, I've never been that lonely figure, in a sense,
Right. It's one thing to be against a system and another to be against humanity, which both B.S. Johnson and Nick Drake seem to have their moments of like, fuck it, I'm turning my back to all of you people.
Quite.
One killed himself, the other may have killed himself. But you seem to not dislike people, which is very important.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think of the story that Ian Sinclair, the British writer Ian Sinclair, who actually lives very close to where we are right now, told me that his wife went to a concert in the 60s when they were just going out with each other. And Ian Sinclair was given a poetry reading. Who else was playing that night was Nick Drake. So his wife filmed the evening. I don't think many people know this story. And she filmed the whole thing. And he said, I have a sneaking suspicion that she actually edited out Nick Drake and just got rid of the footage, thinking, I just want to keep the footage of my husband. But he said it could still be in the loft for all I know. He said all the films are up there. So there could be, remarkably, a video, or sorry, not a video, but a film somewhere of Nick Drake singing in a folk club somewhere with Ian.
One thing we don't have.
Yeah, absolutely, the one thing. And it's just sitting, potentially just sitting there on a shelf in East London in his house. We need to chase up Ian about that, I think. Yeah.
It's he is certainly Ian is one of the figures I've looked into to interview here, but every email I would send to anybody around him would bounce back. So I figure he's got a kind of respectable, maybe he's working on something, or he's cut off communication with the rest of the world for the moment. I don't know, but it's I didn't realize he lived around here. This is, I guess that makes sense though, given where he writes about.
Yeah, absolutely. He lives just off Columbia Road, a house just about 10 minutes from where we are now. He's a really lovely fellow. I mean, we don't sit here and, talk about other figures like this, but he's a really engaging, very easy to access person. But
unless your emails get bounced back.
Yeah, exactly. But, some people enjoy having these walls around them. One thing I've always ensured is that people can get hold of me immediately. They don't have to get through any kind of wall. And it's something I find difficult with other characters sometimes when you want to collaborate or talk to them. How do you get hold of them? Do you have to work through their gallery, who are never going to pass your email on? Are you going to have to go through their manager, who again will never pass your communication on? But chances are you'll meet them at some point, and then suddenly they're really, accessible, nice people. There's no reason. I remain ever optimistic that people are generally good. Ostensibly, they're good at heart. And if they're interested in what you do, they will talk to you and, engage in that sense. So, I mean, a classic example being, we were just in Sydney, my wife and I, and we went to a concert of Mike Patton and Lee Ronaldo from Sonic Youth. And she really wanted to meet Mike Patton. Mike Patton has a huge following in Australia, but as circumstances followed, she then spent the next day travelling with him to the airport. And he was a really nice bloke, she said. Really, really nice, friendly, easygoing guy. And I thought, that's how it is. We have these images always of characters which are presented through other media, other interviews, whatever it may be. And people can act as complete arseholes at times. We certainly know that with all kinds of figures. But my general impression of people is they are ostensibly good and kind and friendly. It's been proven wrong sometimes. I remain ever optimistic, of course, but I think you find, particularly on certain levels of people's works, and, if it's something like music, you're already connected, or if it's words, or if it's pictures in a sense, if you can find a connection point, you're halfway there in a sense. This is a very banal point to make and maybe of no interest to anybody, so I should stop there, I think.
I'm sure it is of interest. I think of the figures that London has produced who work in words, who have produced so many words themselves, by the act of walking around London, by the act of experiencing London, like in Ian Sinclair, but there are many more, each perceiving London in their own way, and then producing whether it is words or sounds or films. Tell me what do you hear when you're walking around London? What do you tune into, considering you've had a lifetime here?
I think what's really intriguing actually is the first time you come to where we are now. I originally come from South London. I was born very close to where the Wimbledon tennis happens, which is it's South London, it's Southfields near Wimbledon. Where we are now is East London. It's sort of polar opposites in a way. So people around here talk like this a lot, like they drop a lot of their letters. You don't really use the letter H very much. You're happy. But what I really like around here is that people call you mate and love. And it's actually, there's an affection which I really love, which is if you were to go to a shop right now this afternoon and a woman serves you, she'll call you love. And a bloke will always call you mate. And there's something incredibly old-fashioned about it still.
So when I go to buy my laptop power cord I need, I'll probably be referred to that way.
Yeah, there's probably say mate, or if it's an Indian store, he'll probably call you boss, which is a little bit kind of unsettling in a way. But what I think is really intriguing is as you go through London, I mean, I think what's of note is the range of colour of people, not only physically, but of their kind of histories. We have a huge community around here, kind of Asian Indian community, as I said earlier. But in fact, what's also intriguing is that if you were to sit on public transport, sometimes you realise that you're probably the only English-speaking person in that carriage on the train.
I mean, I know the feeling in Los Angeles, different types of people, but the same feeling.
And it's absolutely fantastic, I find. I find it really quite intriguing. You can take one walk down the street here and you'll have Polish, Romanian, Pakistani, Bangladesh, English, Australian, American, all kinds of nationalities, all in one place. And I think it's something I really love about London, which is this nexus point for stuff coming through, you know. It's not necessarily about what's here, but it's all the stuff that comes through, both the people, the culture, the music, the literature, whatever it may be, the exhibitions. But it's this constant sense of flux. That's what I really like. So I moved here because it was cheap and it was accessible. 14 or 15 years later, the area around me has grown up. These areas always become gentrified, but it happens at quite a speed, you know. So you have to think, how far does this kind of invisible barrier keep moving out in the city where it still has meaning in a sense, i.e., how far can you go out where you still feel connected to London in a way?
Are you personally, or where one still feels connected to London?
Yeah, where one still feels connected. Because, you know, yes, I could move 3 or 4 more stops down the tube line. Yeah. I could get a much bigger place to live. I'm perfectly happy here, but I could find a much bigger place. But would I feel disconnected? Would those 3 or 4 extra stops mean that you're kind of perversely out of touch with where you are? But there's a rich texture in this city that I really enjoy. You know, there's a wonderful clash of cultures, you know, both kind of religious, historical, nationality, all kinds of things, that brings a really dynamic friction to the city, I think, you know, and is then seen and experienced in work. You certainly know it in the music scene. I mean, the UK has really been recognised as a very vibrant, dynamic music scene. There's all kinds of stuff that comes out, you know, whether it's now that you hear in every advert a kind of grime dubstep music that all came from East London originally. You know, there's a kind of earthiness about it that's still really enthralling to me, you know, and it's a city I'm still not bored with. It's a city that still offers new possibilities. I think if it didn't offer that, then I would be tired. But to this day,
be gone.
Yeah, I'd be gone. But it still offers me so many possibilities that I'm kind of enthralled by it and seduced by it and in love with it still, actually.
Say you were seeing London for the first time, experiencing it for the very first time like I am. Everything's fresh. If you could have that experience, what would you tune into?
I think, you know, you're fortunate you've come to an area of London in the east which is quite dynamic in terms of a kind of an alternative culture. It's curious, isn't it? If you were to arrive in London and arrive in the West End, which is where all the commercial department stores and everything are, and certain friends have done that, they really don't connect with the city. It's the same way when I've been to LA or other places. You arrive in one particular place and think, is this really it? There must be something else. There must be an alternative. And for me, it's always the joy of finding that alternative life, you know, where the other things happen, where this other, you know, living actually happens. I mean, if you were to come to London for the first time, yes, buildings are of a certain height. They're different. If you come from the US, buildings have a certain kind of different depth and height. There's a certain history embedded in Europe, obviously, as well, where, when I walk to the cinema, I pass a solicitor's, which has been there since 1602. The very idea that a solicitor has
Nothing in the States has been anywhere since 1602.
No. And there's something quite fantastic about the fact it's just there on the high street and you just walk past it. As you leave me today and you walk down the high street, you'll pass a building where it's quite incredible, the street. It's where all the gangsters used to live, largely around here. And it's where George Orwell was arrested. He was drunk and disorderly one night. So he was arrested. There's a pub just down the road here where a very famous killing took place, this kind of gangland killing. It's a really intriguing area full of history. And I think that's what I really love about this city, that as soon as you arrive here, you realize that the streets are, in a sense, embedded in a history. Even when you look at the physical structure of the road, you'll see a tarmac, which they put over it. But just beneath that tarmac are all cobblestones. And often when you're walking, you'll see the cobblestones. You'll see,
just put it over.
Yeah, just put it over. So when you walk up Brick Lane, there's cobblestones and sometimes there's tarmac. But it's almost like you can just keep peeling those layers away and the history keeps appearing.
Literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something really magical about that, I think. As soon as you start walking around where you're staying, you'll realize that's actually Jack the Ripper territory.
Right.
But also one of the biggest areas of kind of urban art in the UK, of graffiti, of artists embracing the streets as their canvas. And there's something really exciting that if I was to go there today with you and then we go next week, so much stuff will have changed because it's about taking control of those streets and that wall becomes mine for this moment. But then it changes again. And there's something, again, really exciting about that kind of constant change that keeps me tuned into it.
I've been speaking here in East London with Robin Rimbaud, also better known as Scanner. Robin, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Great to meet you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.